Imagine. Imagination, for me, is not something fantastical or futuristic or science fictive. It's just about opening our eyes to what's around us all the time. It's about realizing that the people who may be best qualified to protect the land are the people who used to be poaching it, as I learnt in Namibia 4 days ago. It's about learning how to read lion tracks at 20 meters, or how to pick up some elephant dung and see a whole history inside it, as I saw just this last weekend. And I think it's about realizing that, of course, humanity needs to preserve the wild, but just as important, it's the wild that preserves our humanity. It's also, of course, the most precious luxury in the modern world, which is that mail away message. Does anything feel as good as putting your email on auto-response and knowing that for 4 or 6 or 8 days, none of your bosses, no spammers can get to you, but the brilliant stars of Namibia can, and the black rhino, and of course the wise words of our leader, Shannon. So I've been in Namibia 7 days only, but already I've seen so much of what imagination can do that I'm really inspired to imagine more rigorously how much I can invest time and thought when I go back home. And so really, before I say anything, I do want to offer heartfelt thanks to our hosts here who've opened up this amazing country to all of us. And I also want to offer thanks to my old friend, Jim Sarno, and my new friends, Shannon and Doyle, and that tremendous team for bringing us all together and for working so hard to make us feel welcome, and even for including in the ATTA tribe someone like me who's no adventurer at all and barely a traveler. In my 56 years on the planet, I had never set foot in Namibia until last week, and only once had been in Southern Africa. And my sense already is, as we all know, this is the first summit on the African continent, but I'm sure it's not going to be the last. And what I've seen in the last few days has so moved me that I decided at the last minute not even to show any slides. That's why when you look up at the screen, you just see this shady character gesticulating manically. I really felt that nothing I could project could begin to live up to what most of us have seen and felt these last few days. And I think I also felt that imagination isn't just about taking in beautiful things. It's really about finding the beauty in the everyday and the unexpected. So that's why no PowerPoint for me. That's why probably everything I say is going to seem powerless and pointless. But when we hear the word imagine, I think we often think about John Lennon, say, imagining people living life in peace. And yet, the tragic truth, as we all know, is that John Lennon died at the hands of somebody who didn't share that vision. So when I think of imagination, I prefer to think of the honorary residents of the here and now, the really practical realists around us, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who begins one of his recent books by saying, "I'm not an optimist, I'm not an idealist, I'm a realist." Or his really close friend, the Dalai Lama, who always says, don't just pray for peace or a better world, work for it. And who also reminds us that violence, conflict, division are probably never going to go away, but how we respond to them is in our hands and in our power at every moment of every day. My experience as a traveler is that wonder tends to come up where least I expect to look for it. And one example is a few years ago, I was reading a not very exhilarating English essayist called G.K. Chesterton. And I found him writing, "We need so to view the world as to combine a sense of wonder and a sense of welcome." And I thought that was pretty good, so I kept on reading. And he said, we need to be happy in this wonderland without being merely comfortable. And of course, every adventure traveler knows that very often happiness goes in one direction and comfort is in the other. And then he asks, how do we contrive to be at once astonished by the world and at home in it? And I thought back to a trip I made not very long ago to Yemen. Why was I in Yemen? Well, why else? I was trying to retrace the footsteps of a 15th century Chinese Muslim eunuch admiral who was leading his long treasure ships and his all-eunuch navies across the oceans from China to as far as Kenya and Oman. And at one point on this trip, I found myself in Aden, the little port in southern Yemen. And I remember that I'd been there at the age of 2 in 1959. And in 1959, Aden was the largest port in the entire world outside of Manhattan. And it buzzed with that special energy that arises when east first touches west. When I went back to Aden a few years ago, it was to find that after 40 years of war, it was the most broken, impoverished, desperate place I think I've ever seen. No shops, no houses, no restaurants. Goats were foraging on the main street. When an occasional car stopped at a red light, a sunken-cheeked old woman would come and hammer on the windows to ask for a handout. It was very hard to find a hotel. I finally found a hotel on the beach, but every time I walked into my hotel, I had to walk through a security machine, as at any airport. And when I finally walked out to the beach, I looked around me, and I saw there were 5 armed men and a wall on one side of me, 5 armed men and a wall on the other side. That was the beach. And yet, all of you know this, I think, from your own experience, as in so many places where people had relatively nothing, they couldn't have been kinder to me, who had relatively everything. And one day a local came up to me and said, "Do you want to look around?" I said, "Yeah, sure. What can we see?" He said, "The cemetery." And we spent a long, hot afternoon just looking at the graves of nuns and soldiers and everybody who had tried to come to be of help in Yemen in the last 40 years. Another time, somebody in my hotel kindly offered to reconfirm my flight out for me. And when I came back in the dusk, he came up to me and said, "Sir, your flight's been a little delayed." "No problem," I said. "How long?" 4 days, he said. I'd been in Aden long enough at that point to realize that 4 days could easily be 4 years or 4 decades. It didn't really seem connected with the world I knew at all. And I had to be out the next day because my wife was flying all the way from Greece to meet me. My bosses were hungry to get reports on the footsteps of the 15th century Chinese eunuch. So I bounced across town to the Yemenia Airlines office, not a member of the Star Alliance, and I presented my predicament to the woman in a veil behind the desk, and she slowly and patiently tapped at her keyboard and said that the only way I could leave the country was by driving all the way across to North Yemen and flying out the next morning from Sana'a at 6 a.m. This was not good news. Not good news partly because, of course, North Yemen and South Yemen had been at war for most of the previous 40 years. Not good news because the main source of revenue for the villages en route was the traditional kidnapping of foreigners. And not good news because check-in was at 4 a.m. It was already 9:30 p.m., so it meant I had to check in 6.5 hours later, and it was at minimum a 6-hour drive. But I had no choice, so I went out into the dark, and I found an old man who was so shattered or so kind, he volunteered to drive me then and there right the way across the country. So we got into this really rickety Peugeot station wagon. He got behind the wheel. I got the distinct impression he'd never been behind the wheel of a car before. And we set off into the dark. And very soon thereafter, we found ourselves in the mountains. And the windows of the tower houses of Yemen gleamed unsettlingly in the dark. And I looked and I saw we were driving right next to a sheer precipice. And then it began to rain, and the car began to slide and rappel and slip towards this huge drop. And it was one of those moments, all of you know them, when I realized I just had to give up. There was nothing that I could do to ensure a happy ending to this story. Everything was outside my control. And I just had to surrender to the gods or the fates or circumstance. So we kept on driving, and suddenly the man stopped. And he got out, and he just walked off. And I sat in the back seat, and I sat, and long minutes passed. Finally, he came back. And I pointed impatiently at my watch because we really didn't have much time. And he opened his hands, and there was a bar of chocolate and a can of Coke. He was really worried that I hadn't been able to get dinner, so he'd gone off to find some food for me. And we kept on driving, and the first call to prayer came up, and then the first light showed over the horizon, and then we ended up in these broad avenues where there were just teenage boys with AK-47s, oil drums. It looked like South Central Los Angeles. And at last, we found the airport terminal, and I raced in, and I just managed to make my flight. So 2 hours later, there I was in Dubai Airport, where you can literally buy a Maserati in the terminal, where there's a 7-star hotel not far away. And of course, I couldn't help but be haunted by the thought that that old man was driving all the way back across the country, and that he was going to have to spend his whole life in this place that was really hard for me just to spend 4 days in. And a couple of weeks later, I went back to my mother's house in the comfortable, gated California resort town of Santa Barbara. And 5 weeks after I left Aden, I was just sitting at my desk there, trying to wonder how I could ever put a place like Yemen even in the same sentence as Santa Barbara. And suddenly my mother came bursting into the room, and she said, "That crazy place you were just in, Yemen, it's all over the news because there were these men, they're flying planes into the World Trade Center. And we're hearing that Yemen is an epicenter of terrorism, and it is our moral duty to wipe this place off the face of the earth." And it's true. Right now, there are 800 members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. But there are also, of course, 22 million other Yemenites who I think in most cases only have friendly feelings towards us. And I was so grateful just as a bungling tourist stumbling through this country that I'd been able to see and feel the place as I never could have if I was just watching it on TV or accessing it on YouTube. These days, I really think that the places that we hear about most are often the places we know least. And I never felt at home in Yemen, of course, but I did feel constantly astonished by it. And as I was hearing the reports of the terrorist attacks, I thought back on the kind man who'd taken me around the graves of his brothers and his sister and his father, and the woman in the Yemenia Airlines office who'd actually painstakingly given me a refund for $40 because my rerouted ticket cost less than the one that I'd originally bought. And of course, the old man, too, who'd gone so deeply out of his way to help me. And visiting, even for a few days, of course, allowed me to imagine what life is like in Yemen. But I think more important, it allowed me to imagine how our life looks to people in places like Yemen. I remember one day I was walking along that broken down town, and I saw just one sign, and it said, "Internet Cafe." So I went down this narrow alleyway and stepped into a tiny room, and there were just 11 computer terminals there, for some reason veiled women at every one, and most of them seemed to be accessing friends and loved ones in New York and the United States, or accessing images of our country. So what does any of this have to do with imagination or adventure? While I was in Namibia, I called my wife up back in Japan, And she said, "What are you meant to be talking about?" And I said, "Adventure travel." And she fell about laughing so much she almost destroyed the international phone lines. Just look at me. You can tell I didn't run the Gobi Marathon this year. I haven't climbed the 7 highest peaks on every continent. I didn't recently surf the North Shore. My old friend Tim Cahill, who I think is here, set a world record for driving from one tip of the Americas to the other in 23 days. I took some of the same trip, but I went by bus. Zita is about to give us, I think, a very inspiring and practical discussion of one particular example in Newfoundland. I'm just babbling on about a long-dead English essayist. But I think all of us in this room know that adventure isn't really about what we do, but how we do it. And it's not just about crossing crevices in the Himalayas, but about going across those empty spaces in our imagination. It matters little how far you go, the furthest, commonly the worst. My favorite adventurer, Henry David Thoreau, said, "What matters is how alive you are." And I think a large part of imagination involves extending our sense of what adventure really is. I've been spending a lot of time recently in Israel, and it took me a long time to acknowledge to myself that one of the greatest sights for a traveler in that country is the other travelers, and in fact, the tour guides. If you sit outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Old Jerusalem, one of the holiest places in the land, every 10 or 15 minutes, 10 or 15 seconds really, a new tour guide comes in and starts to deliver a brilliant, very eloquent, completely convincing explanation of what the site means. But of course, it totally contradicts the explanation you've heard 30 seconds before. Not long ago, I was traveling around Galilee for a day with an Israeli tour guide. And at the end of the day, he said, "Are you confused?" I said, "Yeah, I really am." He said, "Excellent. That means I've done my job. If you are more confused now than when the day began, you know what it's like to live in Israel. This is how we feel every day of our lives." And I now think of another time when I was there not so long ago, and I was staying in a little hospice on the Via Dolorosa in the old city of Jerusalem. I was having breakfast with some strangers, and one was an American man in his 60s, one was a German woman in her 40s, and I asked them, of course, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "Oh, you won't know it. It's a little town in California called Paso Robles." Well, Paso Robles happens to be right next to Santa Barbara, my official home. So I asked them, "How did you get here?" Meaning United or Lufthansa or Yemenia. And they said, "Oh, we walked." They had met walking the Camino to Santiago de Compostela and decided just to continue walking the rest of their lives. So with very, very little money, they had walked across the United States for a year, staying in the houses of people they met along the way. They'd taken a boat to Portugal, walked across Europe for another year. The woman had broken her leg in Italy. She'd spent a month in hospital there. And in fact, even when I met her, she was still on crutches, but every day she was hobbling enthusiastically along the uneven paving stones of Jerusalem. And it really brought home to me what I think we all know, which is that adventure is not just about physical daring, but about moral and emotional and psychological daring. It's not just about shifting your body, it's about shifting your perceptions. Not just about getting out of your home, but getting out of your habits. And I think adventure is about going to a place like Cuba or Burma, where everybody will come up to you with a hand extended and a silent request. What do you do with that? It's about remembering, as Chesterton said, not to seek out the comfortable, but really to go after the places that are most different from the places that you know. I went as a tourist a few years ago to North Korea, and in some ways it's a crazy place to go because everything a tourist sees looks exactly like a photograph. It's really like walking through a blueprint of the great leader's imagination. But when I came back home, I realized that everything I understood by the most fundamental terms, humanity, reality, daily life, had been turned on their heads by North Korea. The real voyage of discovery, as Proust said, consists not in seeing new sights, but in looking with new eyes. And I think everybody in this room knows very keenly what travel can do to and for us, but of course, just as important, maybe more important, is what we can do for and through and to travel. And as Shannon was saying, everybody around us is often saying that the world is getting more and more used up. For every one international traveler in 1960, there are 40 right now. The largest holiday inn in the world is coming up in Mecca. Venice, which has a population of 60,000, sees 24 million tourists every year, which means that for every 401 people you see on the streets of Venice, one will be a local. Yet, I think any of us who's been traveling across Namibia these last few days knows that the world isn't always overcrowded. It's not always corrupted. I remember when I was a teenager, I went by bus to Ecuador and Peru and Brazil, and later went to Jordan. Even when I've been to Europe, Lismore in Ireland or Zurich in Switzerland, to me, look as much themselves as pristine as they might have looked 500 years ago. And I think we hear so much about the bad that tourism can bring in terms of pollution, inner and outer, in terms of corruption, in terms of restlessness. It's easy to forget the good it can do. As you heard, I was just in my ancestral homeland of India, and when I went to Kashmir 2 months ago, I found that the prospect of foreign tourists had brought biotanks there and an environmental sensitivity that wouldn't be there otherwise. If you go to Bali, you will note that tourism has not only regenerated interest in the traditional dances, it's actually inspired new dances. And all of us have seen here in Namibia this wonderful virtuous cycle whereby the government puts money into conservancies, the conservancies attract people like us, we put more money into the economy, and thus the number of conservancies increases and the land is much better protected. And I think one of the great things that any traveler can bring to a country like Namibia or to Cuba is a sense of what is absolutely special and unique about it. If you've never left Namibia, you may not quite appreciate how remarkable your land is. And of course, the sustainability question really asks how we can have places remain themselves while still being accessible to us. How can they serve the needs of the locals as well as the sometimes very different needs of the visitor? Because my sense is that whether you ask somebody from Tibet or Bolivia whether they would rather see tourists or not, I'm thinking 97% of the people would vote for our presence, but of course they would never vote for the demolition of their homeland. So I, as you heard, have been living in rural Japan for 26 years near the ancient capital of Kyoto. And I've been there all those years on a tourist visa, partly because I'm so proud of what tourists can do. Most of you know that Kyoto became the capital of Japan in the year 794 and continued as the capital for more than 1,000 years. And it withstood earthquakes and fire, constant warfare. It was even spared the bombs of World War II thanks to the intercession of various wise commanders in the Allied forces. And yet, after World War II, in the rush to development, in the Japanese miracle, people almost destroyed the whole city. For every one car in Kyoto in 1950, there were 80 by 1994. 40,000 old wooden buildings at the center of the city were razed to the ground. A 17-story hotel was built that destroys the sightlines between the center of the town and the northeast mountains, which is where gods and devils are supposed to live and where everybody therefore wants to keep an eye on. And there was even talk of redirecting the Central River the Kamogawa so that it would more closely resemble the Seine in Paris. It's easy to feel, as the 17th century Japanese poet Basho said, even in Kyoto, I miss Kyoto. Kyoto is the single most visited city in the world outside Mecca. And to put this in proportion, it sees 50 million visitors every year, which is more than the entire continent of Africa. And yet, in the quarter century I've been living there, I would say that Kyoto is actually becoming more beautiful, more stylish, and more itself, and largely because of travel. A young male American novelist wrote that book, Memoirs of a Geisha, and it actually drew Japanese attention to an industry that was almost dead and now thriving again. Another American man started buying up wooden houses and then renting them out to visitors. And this turned out to be so successful, Japanese started doing the same. Meanwhile, more and more Japanese are traveling around the world and bringing in fresh ideas about how to make their place a little cooler, more like Europe, but minus the Seine. And when the Kyoto Buddhist Association, which represents 1,000 temples, was wanting to make a plea to rescue Kyoto, they took out a full-page ad, but not in one of the great Japanese newspapers like the Yomiuri Shimbun or the Asahi Shimbun. They took out an ad in the New York Times because they felt it was only foreigners who would really come to the rescue of their city. And so I think imagination means, in part, as Shannon was saying, not complaining about problems, but seeing the opportunities that are hiding out inside them. Imagination means looking so closely at reality that you can see the possibilities lurking within it. And it means understanding that preservation doesn't mean keeping a place exactly the same. It means allowing it to grow, but in a way consistent with itself. That's why if you go to the most sacred Shinto shrine in Japan at Ise, you will find it is completely rebuilt every 20 years, so it's always in exactly the same state of decay. In fact, that process was culminated just 2 weeks ago. It means that when you go to Kyoto, you'll hear about a very famous 19th century company that used to make playing cards, but then a few years ago began to find that people were playing different kinds of games, and that company, Nintendo, decided to revolutionize the video game industry. It means going to a 17th century inn like Tawaraya and finding that nowadays they have to include TVs and telephones because many visitors want that, but they cover them with fabric so that every time you go into a room, it looks exactly like a classic tatami empty room from 300 years ago. And I once asked the owner of that place, the 9th generation owner, how she managed to keep the spirit alive after 350 years. And she said, you keep the spirit alive by constantly changing the style. So I just want to end by saying I've talked a bit about imagination as an exercise in opening your eyes, but I think it also involves something that sounds similar but is a little different, and that's not closing your eyes. The main thing I have learned in my travels is that every assumption I make about which places are going to be rich, which are going to be safe, and which are going to be interesting are completely wrong. Why do so many of us from North America or Europe long to come to Namibia when I'm sure many Namibians would love to see North America and Europe? It's because we understand that this country is rich in exactly the things we don't always have enough of: stillness, silence, abundant natural beauty, and antiquity. I remember when I began traveling in my 20s in the 1980s, I went to observe the wars in Nicaragua and Honduras and El Salvador, and then to witness the revolutions in Cuba and the Philippines. And of course, nothing bad ever happened to me in any of those places. And then I came back to comfortable, affluent, protected Santa Barbara, and my house burnt down with me pretty much inside it. Statistically, the majority of accidents take place within a half mile of your home. So really, if you want to be safe, you should take to the road. The more you're traveling, the safer you are. If only I'd been reading the newspapers when I was a kid, I would have seen that in the 1980s, there were civil wars, as you remember, in Beirut, Afghanistan, El Salvador, and Northern Ireland, and Washington, D.C. had a higher murder rate than in all but one of them. So I think for most people in the world, it's New York City and L.A. that are really the dangerous places. And as I say also, I never know in advance what is going to be life-changing when I go to a place. So earlier this month, I was spending many weeks traveling across Iran. And of course, I was transported, as any visitor is, by the blue tile mosques in Isfahan and the mud brick walls in the old city of Yazd and the ruins of Persepolis. But I think what's really going to stay with me is the kid who stole me into the most sacred shrine in the whole of the country, even as he was telling me how he had spent $2,500 to sit inside a truck and steal out of the country so that he could escape it. What I'll also remember is sitting in a rooftop bar where the waiters were going around taking orders on iPads from women draped in Dior and Gucci and Louis Vuitton. And the Iranian who, every time we were driving down the street, took great pains to point out the pedestrian who looked most like John Cleese, and then launched into an encomium to Mr. Bean. And it was just a reminder to me, as every trip is, of how limited my imagination is, and of how adventure is not just about conquering the unknown, but about preserving it, and preserving a duly humble sense of how much will always lie beyond our reckoning, beyond our understanding, and beyond our control. I think when we talk about imagination, let's imagine real life. And when we talk about inspiration, let's think about inspiring new ideas and visions. And when we talk about investment, let's invest engagement and attention as much as funds. Because I think the main lesson I have taken away from all my travels is that nowhere is uninteresting to the interested eye. Thanks very much.